Hey there, everybody. This is Ryan with Volpine Marketing coming at you live from my kitchen because we are in the middle of the coronavirus. So I had someone reach out to me, a counselor in St. George, and what they're wanting is they're wanting to do a little bit better in Google search, just hoping to get some more clients from the internet. So I'm going to go through kind of their website and maybe make some recommendations on what might be able to help them. First off, I'm just going to look and kind of take a look and see how they're doing for different terms, right? So what I do is I use a tool called Bright Local Search Results Checker. And you can find that simply by typing in Bright Local Search Results Checker. It'll be one of the top results there. Boom, this one. And what it does is it allows you to be able to see how search results vary based on your zip code, based on your location. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to look up counselor, and I'm going to do so from the location of St. George, Utah. Wow, if I could spell. So, and then I'm going to see just what Google looks like from there, right? And you can look at the different pages based on that. So go ahead and I'll just look at page number 1 here. So I'm here. What's interesting is when I search counselor, obviously there's some local search results here that pop up. That's fantastic. But when I go down here to where some people may look, it pulls up things like the definition of counselor and counselor versus therapist, and really not necessarily giving me what I may be looking for as a consumer. So what a lot of people will do to kind of help this process is they will add what's called a geo modifier. So they will, instead of searching for counselor, they might go counselor in St. George or something like that, or St. George counselor, right? And I'm just going to look and kind of see the search results and kind of see how that might be different. And this is kind of an important thing that a lot of people will add those geo modifiers because they're looking for counselors that are near them. As you can see here, there's some of the same players that are performing in these search results as they were for this generic counselor. And a lot of people will go to these what's called local map search results. So they could go here, but if they go down here deeper, what's interesting is, there we find a little bit more relevant information, right? Oh, it looks like they spell out Saint rather than doing the abbreviation. So they have all these different results that you can find. So this is fantastic. What would be great for my client is if they could be able to be well positioned here. Unfortunately, what's going on is we have a website here that isn't necessarily optimized per se for St. George. Right now, this website talks a lot about counseling, talks about a lot of different things, but what it doesn't necessarily talk about explicitly is St. George and adding that in there. So one of my top recommendations here would be, that we add some content about St. George. And I'm not saying like write about necessarily St. George. I'm saying if you talk about counseling in St. George, counselor in St. George counselor, use these particular terms that people are actually searching in Google to be able to find them. What's interesting is this counselor, when she reached out to me, said a lot of people are finding me and reaching out to me from Psychology Today, and I can't figure it out. Well, when you do this particular type of search and you can see, oh, look, Psychology Today is the #1 and the #2 search result there organically or in this portion of the Google search result page. So it's not too surprising that people are clicking on here, finding her, and then reaching out to her. So my #1 recommendation is to optimize this page, your website, for St. George Counselor, St. George Counseling, those particular things, and you're going to be more likely to be able to pop up here. Because if we look at some of these pages, we can see that they have optimized this page for St. George, right? So it's not too surprising that they're performing very well. It's also not too surprising because Psychology Today is a really big website and fairly authoritative, so it is going to pop up. But if we even look down here at some of the other websites that are showing up, you can see here, this is one of the #1 like actual counselor websites in the area that's performing well, Justin Stun. As you can see here, he has optimized his web page for this particular query. So unsurprisingly, he is performing relatively well because his website is properly optimized. So here he has this kind of top portion here, says St. George, Utah, counselor and therapist. Perfect. That's exactly the type of content that we need to add to your website. Now, this is in a particular coding format. And what I mean by that, if I come in here into the actual code of his page, he has this in what's called an H1 element. So this is the header. That's what H1 kind of stands for, is like the number one header, essentially. So he has, excuse me, this term actually in that H1, in that element there in the code, and Google looks at and considers pretty heavily what the content of that H1 is. So for your website, that's what you need to add, is H1 or header element 1, St. George Counselor, St. George Counseling, and then you'll be better off doing that. Some other things that I realized, you really do have some pretty good pages here that are pretty specific to what you offer. And what I'm always going to recommend is people creating content around specific things that they offer that may make them unique or may help them be able to perform better in really, really specific searches. So we have a page here for women's counseling, and then we have a page here for teen counseling. Perfect. So what's interesting is if we click on teen counseling, once again, I'm going to recommend what we do to this page is we try to optimize it and try to have it do well for St. George related queries. Because right now it's just targeting general teen counseling, which is very broad. And if you're one, it would be very difficult to perform in Google searches for specifically teen counseling. That's a very broad term, but it's certainly possible to perform for St. George teen counseling or teen counseling in St. George, Utah. Those are perfectly acceptable and likely to be able to be accomplished. What I like about this page is it is very long, it is very in depth. I'm really impressed with the content that I'm seeing here as far as kind of the way that it targets and talks about these particular topics. But the only issue is, this top element here is frustrated about what to do with your teenager. This is really good, but what it should be is St. George Teen Counseling once again. But what's kind of cool is because you do have a page here that's dedicated for this particular term, I'm going to come in here and I am going to do another search in St. George, Utah. And this time I'm going to go teen counselor, right? And I'm going to hop here into Google Maps maybe, and because these will give you different results. This is just kind of the normal Google search page. This one is the maps result. So when I click on here and I actually look into this page, I can see that your website is actually performing here, right? It's probably like number 7, number 8 spot, but that is significantly more competitive than you were doing for just general counselor. So that could be a huge advantage for you, is if we did optimize the site a little bit more for teen counselor, you could likely climb up in search results here and be more competitively positioned as a result. So that would be some of the things I'd recommend. I love the fact that you've created this teen counselor page. I think that's going to be very effective. I love the fact that you have the women's counselor page. I think those are good. If there's other specialties that you have that you offer, I would recommend creating specific landing pages to target those things. And that's going to help you in the long run because you are creating more specific content to whatever those more specific searches might be. So anyways, I hope that's helpful. Have a wonderful day.